The photograph in her hand had edges curled black from fire, the faces barely visible through the char marks, and Josephine Garrett held it against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her heart beating, as she stumbled into Chico, California on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878. Dust coated her travel-worn dress. Her boots had holes that let in the burning sand from the road, and her dark hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. But none of that mattered as much as the burned photograph she clutched in her trembling fingers. The saloon doors swung open as she approached, and she could hear piano music spilling out into the street along with raucous laughter. Josephine had $3 to her name and nowhere to sleep. No family waiting for her. Nothing but the clothes on her back and that photograph that she would not let go of even when her fingers cramped from holding it so tight. She pushed through the doors and felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Behind the bar stood a woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. Josephine walked toward her on unsteady legs, trying to remember when she had last eaten. The woman looked her up and down with a shrewd expression that softened slightly when she saw how young Josephine was, barely 22 years old, and looking like she had walked through hell itself. "Need work," Josephine said, her voice hoarse from days of little water. "I can clean, cook, anything you need." The woman set down her glass. "Name is Martha. This is my establishment. You running from something, girl?" Josephine's fingers tightened around the photograph. "Running towards something, maybe, or away. I am not sure anymore." Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I've got a room upstairs, small thing, but it is clean. You can work serving drinks and cleaning up. 3 meals a day and $1 a week. That work for you?" "Yes, madam," Josephine whispered, relief flooding through her so strongly her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you." Martha came around the bar and steadied her with a firm hand. "When is the last time you ate?" 2 days ago. Maybe 3. Lord have mercy." "Come on then. Let me get you fed before you fall over dead in my saloon." She led Josephine through a back door into a small kitchen where the smell of stew made Josephine's stomach clench with hunger. Martha ladled out a generous bowl and set it in front of her along with thick slices of bread. Josephine tried to eat slowly, but her body had other ideas, and she finished the bowl in minutes. Martha refilled it without comment. "That photograph must be mighty important," Martha said quietly, nodding at where Josephine still clutched it in her left hand even as she ate with her right. Josephine looked down at the burned edges, at the faces that were more memory now than visible image. "It is all I have left." Martha did not press for more information, just let her eat in peace. When Josephine had finished 2 bowls of stew and half a loaf of bread, Martha showed her upstairs to a small room at the end of the hall. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the main street of Chico. To Josephine, it looked like paradise. "Get some rest," Martha said. "You can start work tomorrow evening. Saturday nights are busy, so I will need you sharp." Josephine nodded, already moving toward the bed. She collapsed onto it fully clothed, the photograph pressed against her heart, and fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. She woke to the sound of horses in the street below, and sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic seized her chest until she saw the simple room around her and remembered Martha's kindness. The photograph lay on the pillow beside her head where it must have fallen when she finally relaxed enough to sleep. She picked it up carefully, studying the burned edges and the barely visible faces within. A woman, young and beautiful with Josephine's same dark eyes. A man with his arm around her, smiling. And a small girl between them, maybe 5 years old, grinning at the camera with missing front teeth. The fire had eaten away most of their features, but Josephine did not need to see clearly to remember every detail. That photograph was burned into her memory as surely as the fire had burned it in reality. She stood and walked to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. Her reflection in the small mirror showed hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes, but at least she was alive. At least she had made it here, to this town where nobody knew her story and nobody would ask questions she could not bear to answer. The afternoon sun was already heating the room when she finally went downstairs. The saloon was quiet in the daylight hours, just a few men playing cards in the corner and one solitary drinker at the bar. Martha was counting bottles behind the bar and looked up when Josephine appeared. "There is stew left from last night if you are hungry," she said. "And I laid out a dress in the storage room that should fit you better than those rags you are wearing." Josephine looked down at her torn and filthy traveling dress. "I can pay you back once I have earned enough. Consider it part of your wages. Cannot have my girls looking like they crawled out of the desert, even if they did." The dress Martha had found was simple blue calico, worn but clean and only slightly too large. Josephine changed in the storage room, carefully tucking the photograph into the pocket she found sewn into the skirt. She could feel its slight weight there, a constant reminder against her hip. That evening the saloon filled with cowboys, miners, and townsmen looking to spend their wages on whiskey and cards. Josephine moved between the tables with a tray, serving drinks and dodging wandering hands with practiced ease. She had learned quickly on her journey that a woman alone had to be sharp and quick if she wanted to stay safe. It was near midnight when the doors swung open, and a man walked in who made several of the patrons sit up straighter in their chairs. He was tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky, wearing a dusty brown hat and a worn leather vest over a dark shirt. A gun hung low on his hip in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. "Barrett," one of the card players called out, "did not expect to see you back in town so soon." The man touched the brim of his hat in greeting but did not stop until he reached the bar. "Just passing through, picking up supplies before heading back out." Martha poured him a whiskey without being asked. "How did the drive go?" "Well enough. Lost 2 head to a river crossing, but otherwise no trouble." He took a sip of his drink and his eyes swept the room, pausing when they landed on Josephine. She felt his gaze like a physical touch and looked away quickly, busying herself with collecting empty glasses from a nearby table. "New girl?" she heard him ask Martha quietly. "Started today." "She needed work. I needed help. That is all you need to know, Barrett Harrison." He chuckled at that. "Fair enough. You always did know how to mind your own business and everyone else's too." Josephine kept working, trying to ignore the way she could feel his eyes following her occasionally as the night wore on. There was something about him that made her nervous in a way that was different from the usual wariness she felt around strange men. This was not fear exactly, but something else she could not quite name. Near closing time, she was wiping down a table near the bar when she heard glass breaking. One of the drunker patrons had knocked over his bottle and was cursing loudly. Josephine grabbed a rag and moved to clean it up, but the man grabbed her wrist as she bent down. "You are a pretty thing," he slurred, his grip painful. "How about you come upstairs with me?" "Let go," Josephine said firmly, trying to pull away. His grip tightened. "I said," and she said, "let go." Barrett Harrison was suddenly there, his hand on the drunk man's shoulder. He did not raise his voice or threaten, but there was steel in his tone that made the drunk release Josephine immediately and stumble backward. "I did not mean nothing," the man muttered. "Then get on home and sleep it off," Barrett said quietly. The man left without another word. Josephine rubbed her wrist where red marks were already forming and looked up at Barrett. "Thank you, but I could have handled it." "I am sure you could have," he agreed, tipping his hat to her. "But you should not have to." He walked back to the bar and finished his drink, then left with a farewell to Martha. Josephine watched him go, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. She reached into her pocket and touched the photograph, grounding herself in the familiar texture of burned paper. The weeks that followed fell into a steady rhythm. Josephine worked evenings in the saloon, spent mornings exploring Chico and getting to know the town, and kept largely to herself. She made no friends beyond a polite acquaintance with Martha and the other women who worked at the saloon. She spoke little about herself and asked fewer questions of others. The photograph never left her person, either in her pocket or under her pillow at night. Barrett Harrison came through town every few weeks, always staying just one night before heading back out to whatever ranch or cattle drive occupied his time. He was unfailingly polite to Josephine, tipping his hat when he saw her and stepping in if any of the patrons got too rough, but he never asked her questions. Never pressed her for her story or wondered aloud where she had come from or why she was here. That silence, that acceptance without explanation, made something in Josephine's chest loosen just slightly. One evening in late September, 3 months after she had arrived in Chico, Barrett came in looking more tired than usual. He had a cut above his eyebrow that had been cleaned but not properly treated, and he moved like his ribs hurt. Martha took one look at him and shook her head. "What happened this time? Cattle thieves," he said simply. "We ran them off, but not before they got a few good hits in. That cut needs proper tending, or it will scar worse than it has to. Josephine, you have got steady hands. Take him upstairs and clean it properly." Josephine felt her heart jump but nodded. Barrett looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it when Martha fixed him with a stern look. He followed Josephine upstairs to her small room, moving carefully like every step hurt. "Sit," she told him, pointing to the chair by the window. She gathered clean water and cloth, along with a small bottle of whiskey Martha kept for medicinal purposes. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the cut, even though being this close to him made her pulse race in a way she had not felt since before the fire. "You are good at this," Barrett said quietly, his eyes on her face. "My mother was a nurse during the war," Josephine replied without thinking, then froze. She never talked about her mother, never talked about before. But Barrett just nodded. "Mine too, in a way, patched up everyone on our ranch when they got hurt, whether they wanted her to or not." Josephine relaxed slightly and continued working. "You have a ranch, my family does. The Harrison Ranch about 20 miles north of here. I run cattle drives mostly, but I help out there between jobs." "Sounds like a good life," she said softly. "It is. Honest work, open sky, good horses." He paused. "Gets lonely sometimes, though." She finished cleaning the cut and stepped back. "There, that should heal clean now." Barrett stood, wincing slightly. "Thank you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin, but Josephine shook her head. "Martha already pays me." "Then take it as a thank you from me personally." Their eyes met and held, and Josephine felt that strange stirring in her chest again, stronger this time. She looked away first, her hand instinctively moving to her pocket where the photograph rested. Barrett noticed the gesture, his eyes following her movement, but he said nothing. Just tipped his hat and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. That night Josephine dreamed of fire. She woke gasping, clutching the photograph so hard it crumpled slightly in her grip. She smoothed it out carefully, tears streaming down her face in the darkness. The faces in the photograph looked back at her, barely visible but so deeply remembered. Her mother's laugh, her father's strong hands, her own younger self who had not yet known what loss tasted like. The fire had started in the middle of the night. Some accident with the stove, the marshal had said later, though Josephine had never believed that. She had been visiting her aunt in Sacramento, had been away from home for the first time in her life, and when she returned it was to find her house burned to the foundation and her parents dead. Her aunt had tried to make her stay, but Josephine could not bear it. Could not bear the pity in everyone's eyes or the questions about what she would do now. So she had taken the photograph, the only thing that had survived, and left. Just started walking until she found herself here in Chico, holding onto that burned photograph like it was her last breath. She did not go back to sleep that night. Just sat by the window watching the stars fade into dawn, the photograph in her lap. The next time Barrett came through town, it was mid-October and the air had taken on a crisp edge that promised winter. He came into the saloon just after sunset and took his usual place at the bar. Josephine brought him his whiskey without being asked, and he thanked her with that quiet courtesy that was so much a part of him. "How is the cut healing?" she asked. He touched his eyebrow where a thin scar was already forming. "Clean as you promised. You have got a gift for healing." "My mother did. I just learned from watching her." It was the second time she had mentioned her mother to him, and the words felt both strange and oddly freeing. Barrett sipped his drink and looked at her with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was the best woman I ever knew," Josephine said, her voice catching slightly. She reached for her pocket, touching the photograph through the fabric, and Barrett's eyes followed the gesture again. But still he said nothing, asked nothing, just let her have her secrets. "I am heading back to the ranch tomorrow," he said after a moment. "Staying through winter this year to help my father with some repairs. Probably will not be back in town much until spring." Josephine felt an unexpected disappointment settle in her stomach. "I hope it is a good winter for you then." "Same to you," he said, and something in his tone made her look up. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and careful and almost sad. "Take care of yourself, Josephine." It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it in his voice made her breath catch. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned back to her work. But she watched from the corner of her eye as he finished his drink and left, and the saloon felt emptier without him in it. Winter came to Chico with cold rain and gray skies. The saloon was quieter during the winter months with fewer travelers passing through, and Josephine found herself with more idle time than she knew what to do with. She helped Martha with extra cleaning, learned to make better bread, and spent long hours in her room staring at the photograph and trying to figure out what she was supposed to do with the rest of her life. Christmas came and went. Martha closed the saloon for the day and made a feast for the women who worked there, and it was nice in its way. But it only reminded Josephine of Christmases before when her family had been whole and happy. She excused herself early and cried into her pillow, the photograph pressed against her chest. January brought snow, unusual for Chico but not unheard of. The town went quiet and still, everything blanketed in white, and Josephine stood at her window watching it fall and thinking about Barrett Harrison on his ranch, 20 miles north. She wondered if he was warm, if his family was kind, if he ever thought about the quiet girl who served him drinks and never explained why she was always touching her pocket. She told herself it did not matter. He was just a cowboy who came through town sometimes, nothing more. But her heart knew she was lying. In February the snow melted and the first travelers of the season started coming through again. Josephine fell back into her routine, but now she found herself watching the door every evening, hoping to see a tall figure in a dusty brown hat walk through. Days passed, then weeks, and she started to think maybe he had decided not to come back to town after all. Then one evening in early March, the doors swung open and there he was. Barrett Harrison, looking wind-burned and tired but smiling as Martha greeted him warmly. His eyes found Josephine across the room and his smile widened slightly. She felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Survived the winter?" Martha asked him as she poured his whiskey. "Barely. The roof on the main barn collapsed under snow weight. Took us 2 months to rebuild it." He accepted the drink and took a long sip. "But it is done now and stronger than before. Sometimes things have to break before they can be built back better." Josephine, passing by with a tray of drinks, heard that and felt the words settle somewhere deep inside her. Sometimes things have to break before they can be built back better. She thought about the photograph in her pocket, about the life that had burned to ashes, about the girl she used to be before grief hollowed her out. Later that evening, during a lull in customers, Barrett approached her where she was wiping down tables. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked. "Just around town, nothing improper. I have been cooped up on the ranch all winter and I could use some company." Josephine hesitated, her hand moving toward her pocket, but something in his earnest expression made her nod. "Let me tell Martha." They walked through the quiet streets of Chico with a careful foot of space between them. The night air was cool but not cold, and overhead the stars blazed in magnificent profusion. Barrett kept his hands in his pockets and did not try to touch her, just walked beside her in comfortable silence until they reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. "I thought about you this winter," he said suddenly. "Wondered if you were doing all right." Josephine's breath caught. "Why?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the starlight. "Because you look like someone carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear alone. And because in all the months I have known you, you have never once looked like you believe you deserve kindness." She felt tears prick her eyes and looked away. "You do not know anything about me." "I know enough," he said gently. "I know you work hard and keep to yourself, and you are kind even when people do not deserve it. I know something hurt you badly enough that you hold on to it every moment of every day." His eyes flicked to her pocket where her hand had automatically moved to touch the photograph. "And I know that whatever you are carrying, whatever that is in your pocket, you do not have to explain it to me or anyone else unless you want to." A tear escaped and ran down her cheek. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you not ask?" "Because some things are too big for words," Barrett said simply. "And because I figure when you are ready to talk about it, if you ever are, you will know. Until then, it is none of my business." Josephine pulled the photograph from her pocket with shaking hands. She had not shown it to anyone since she arrived in Chico. Had barely looked at it herself, except in the dark privacy of her room. But something about Barrett's patient acceptance made her want him to see, want him to understand without having to explain every painful detail. She held it out to him and he took it carefully, studying the burned edges and the barely visible faces. "Your family?" he asked quietly. "My parents, and me when I was 5. Her voice broke. "There was a fire. I was away visiting my aunt, and when I came back they were gone. The house was gone. Everything was gone except this photograph. Someone found it in the yard where the wind must have blown it. It is all I have left of them." Barrett handed the photograph back with the same care he had taken it. "I am so sorry, Josephine." "I could not stay there," she continued, the words spilling out now that she had started. "Everyone looked at me like I was broken, like I was this tragic thing to be pitied. My aunt wanted me to stay with her, but I could not breathe in that house, so I left. Just started walking until I ended up here." "How long ago?" 2 years. "The fire was 2 years ago this April." Barrett was quiet for a long moment, and Josephine braced herself for the pity, for the careful, awkward comfort that people always tried to offer when they heard about tragedy. But when he spoke, his voice was just sad and understanding. "Grief is a strange thing," he said. "It does not follow any rules or timelines, and carrying it alone only makes it heavier." "I do not know how to put it down," Josephine whispered. "Maybe you do not have to put it down," Barrett suggested. "Maybe you just need someone to help you carry it." She looked up at him, at his honest face and kind eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. The photograph in her hand felt slightly less heavy than it had moments before. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because I have been watching you for months, and I think you are one of the strongest people I have ever met," he said simply. "And because I would very much like to get to know you better if you would let me." Josephine's heart was pounding. "I am not whole. I am broken and sad, and I do not know if I can ever be happy again." "You do not have to be whole to be worthy of care," Barrett said gently. "And you do not have to be happy all the time to deserve companionship. You just have to be willing to try." She looked down at the photograph in her hands, at the faces that smiled up at her through the burn marks. Her mother who had taught her to be strong. Her father who had taught her to be kind. The little girl she used to be who had not yet learned that love could end in ashes. What would they want for her now? Would they want her to spend the rest of her life holding on to their memories so tightly she could not move forward? Or would they want her to honor them by living, by opening her heart again, even though it was terrifying? "I would like to get to know you better too," she said quietly. "But I cannot promise anything. I cannot promise that I will not have bad days or that I will not always carry this grief with me." "I am not asking for promises," Barrett said. "Just a chance." They walked back to the saloon in silence, but this time their hands brushed occasionally and neither of them pulled away. At the door, Barrett tipped his hat to her. "I am heading back to the ranch tomorrow, but I will be in town again next week. Maybe we could take another walk." "I would like that," Josephine said, and meant it. She watched him walk away into the night, the photograph still in her hand. When she finally went up to her room, she looked at it for a long time before carefully placing it on the small shelf above her bed instead of under her pillow. It was a small change, but it felt significant. Like maybe she could learn to carry her grief somewhere other than pressed against her heart every moment. The next week, Barrett returned as promised, and they took another walk through town. This time they talked more, and Josephine found herself telling him stories about her childhood, about her mother's terrible singing voice and her father's skill at woodworking. She cried a little, but she also laughed, and that felt like a small miracle. The weeks turned into months, and Barrett came to town more frequently. Sometimes they walked, sometimes they just sat on the bench outside the saloon and talked while the sun set. He told her about life on the ranch, about his parents and his two younger sisters. He talked about the cattle drives and the freedom of the open range, about the hard work and the satisfaction of a job well done. Josephine found herself drawn to his steady presence, to the way he never pushed her to be anything other than what she was in that moment. Martha noticed, of course. "That Harrison boy is sweet on you," she said one afternoon while they were preparing for the evening crowd. Josephine felt her cheeks heat. "We are just friends." "Friends," Martha repeated with a knowing look. "Sure, and I am the Queen of England." But she was right, Josephine knew. What had started as friendship was becoming something more. She thought about Barrett when he was not there, caught herself smiling at things he had said, felt her heart race when she saw him walk through the door. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. One evening in late May, nearly a year after Josephine had first arrived in Chico, Barrett asked her to come visit the ranch. "Just for a day," he said quickly, seeing her hesitation. "My mother has been asking to meet you, and I thought you might like to see the place." I can drive you out in the morning and have you back by evening." Josephine's first instinct was to refuse. The photograph was on her shelf now instead of in her pocket, but she still was not sure she was ready for this kind of step forward. But then she thought about how patient Barrett had been, how he had never once made her feel like she was too broken or too sad, how he had helped her carry her grief without even trying to take it from her. "All right," she said. "I would like that." The morning they left for the ranch was clear and warm with a gentle breeze that smelled of wildflowers and grass. Barrett drove the wagon with easy competence, and Josephine sat beside him watching the landscape roll past. She had brought the photograph with her, tucked carefully in her pocket, but its weight felt different now. Less like an anchor dragging her down and more like a talisman connecting her to love that had been real and true, even if it had ended. The Harrison Ranch was beautiful in a simple, honest way. The main house was 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The barn Barrett had mentioned rebuilding stood tall and sturdy with fresh paint gleaming in the sun. Horses grazed in paddocks, cattle dotted the distant hills, and everything spoke of hard work and care. Barrett's mother met them on the porch, a small woman with gray-streaked brown hair and her son's kind eyes. "You must be Josephine," she said warmly. "I am Margaret Harrison. I have heard so much about you." "It is wonderful to meet you, madam," Josephine said, trying not to feel nervous. Margaret took her hand in both of hers. "Please call me Margaret. Come inside, I have lunch ready and I want to hear all about you." The inside of the house was as welcoming as the outside, with worn but comfortable furniture and windows that let in streams of golden light. Barrett's father was a quieter version of his son, tall and weathered with rough hands and an easy smile. His sisters, Emily and Rachel, were 17 and 15 respectively, bubbling with curiosity about the woman their brother had been talking about for months. Over lunch, Josephine found herself relaxing. The Harrisons did not press her with questions or treat her like she was fragile. They just included her in their conversation naturally, laughing and teasing each other with the comfortable ease of a close family. It reminded her painfully of her own family, but for the first time that pain was not the only thing she felt. There was also warmth and a tentative hope that maybe, someday, she could belong to something like this again. After lunch, Barrett showed her around the ranch. They walked through the barn where he introduced her to his favorite horse, a big bay gelding named Copper. They climbed to the top of the hill behind the house and looked out over the ranch land spreading in all directions. "This is where I come when I need to think," Barrett said. "Something about the view makes problems seem smaller." Josephine reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph. She studied it in the sunlight, seeing details she had memorized years ago. "I think I am ready to stop running," she said quietly. Barrett looked at her. "What do you mean? When I left Sacramento, I thought I was trying to find something. But I think I was really just running away from the grief, trying to escape it." She traced the burned edges of the photograph. "But you cannot escape grief. It follows you wherever you go. So maybe instead of running, I need to find a place to stand still, a place to heal." "Is Chico that place?" Barrett asked carefully. Josephine turned to look at him, at this man who had shown her such patient kindness, who had never asked her to explain her pain but had helped her carry it anyway, who had made her believe that maybe she could be broken and healing at the same time. "I think it might be. If you are there." Barrett's face transformed with a smile so bright it took her breath away. "Josephine, I have been half in love with you since the first night I saw you walk into Martha's saloon looking like you were holding the whole world in your hands. If you are willing to give me a chance, I promise I will spend every day trying to earn your trust and your heart." "You already have them," Josephine said, and realized it was true. Somewhere between the silent acceptance and the gentle walks, and the way he had looked at her burned photograph like it was precious, she had fallen in love with Barrett Harrison. It was not the same as putting down her grief or forgetting her parents. But it was choosing to let love in again, even though she knew it could hurt. It was choosing to live instead of just surviving. Barrett stepped closer, giving her time to move away if she wanted, but Josephine stayed still. He cupped her face gently in his calloused hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made tears spill down her cheeks. It was sweet and careful and full of promise, and when they finally drew apart, Josephine was smiling through her tears. "I am still sad sometimes," she warned him. "I still have days when the grief feels too heavy." "Then I will help you carry it," Barrett said simply. "That is what people who love each other do." They stood on that hilltop for a long time, holding each other and watching the sun move across the sky. Josephine kept the photograph in her hand, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt like maybe it did not have to be all she had left. Maybe she could hold onto the memory of her parents while also reaching for a future with Barrett. Maybe broken things could be mended, not by pretending the breaks did not exist, but by building something new that honored what had been lost. When they returned to the house, Margaret took one look at their joined hands and smiled. "Will you stay for supper, Josephine?" "I would love to," Josephine said. That summer passed in a golden haze of happiness mixed with the ever-present shadow of grief. Josephine continued working at the saloon, but she spent more and more time at the ranch with Barrett and his family. Margaret taught her to ride better, and Emily and Rachel adopted her like an older sister. Barrett's father taught her about cattle and ranching, and slowly Josephine began to feel like she belonged somewhere again. She still had hard days when the weight of loss felt crushing. Days when she woke up crying and could not stop, when the photograph in her hands blurred with tears. But Barrett was always there on those days, not trying to fix her or make the pain go away, just sitting with her and letting her grieve. And slowly, the hard days became fewer, and the good days became more frequent. In August, Barrett took her back to the hilltop where they had first kissed and pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we have not been courting long," he said, his voice nervous in a way she had never heard before. "And I know you are still healing. But I love you, Josephine Garrett, with everything I am. I love your strength and your courage and the way you keep going even when it is hard. I love how you honor your parents by carrying their memory with you, and I would be honored if you would marry me." Josephine looked at the ring in the box, then at Barrett's hopeful face, then down at the photograph she had pulled from her pocket without thinking. Her parents smiled up at her through the burn marks, frozen forever in a moment of happiness. What would they say if they could speak? Would they want her to marry this good, kind man who loved her despite her brokenness? She thought she knew the answer. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Barrett's whoop of joy echoed across the ranch land as he swept her up and spun her around. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that fit perfectly. Josephine looked at it through tears, then looked at the photograph one more time before tucking it back in her pocket. "They would have loved you," she told Barrett. "I wish I could have met them," he said honestly. "But I will spend my life making sure you know you are loved and cared for. That is a promise." They were married in September in a small church in Chico with Martha and the saloon girls in attendance along with Barrett's whole family. Josephine wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, and she carried the photograph in a special pocket sewn into the skirt. As she walked down the aisle toward Barrett, she felt her parents' presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, blessing her choice. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the preacher asked if she took Barrett to be her husband, Josephine said, "I do," in a clear, strong voice that did not waver. When Barrett kissed her as his wife, she felt something inside her chest expand and bloom like a flower opening to sunlight. The reception at the ranch was full of laughter and dancing and food. Josephine danced with Barrett, with his father, with Martha, who had tears in her eyes. She laughed with Emily and Rachel, who were already planning to visit constantly. And when the sun set and the guests began to leave, Barrett took her hand and led her to the small house his father had helped him build on the far edge of the ranch property. "It is not much yet," Barrett said, suddenly nervous again, "but it is ours, and we can add to it as we need to." Josephine looked at the little house with its fresh paint and wide windows. "It is perfect." That night they lay together in their new bed, talking quietly in the darkness. Josephine told Barrett more stories about her parents, things she had not been able to talk about before. He listened and asked questions and made her laugh with his commentary. And when she finally fell asleep, the photograph on the bedside table instead of clutched in her hand, she dreamed not of fire but of open skies and a future full of possibility. The first year of marriage was not always easy. Josephine had days when the grief still hit her like a physical blow, when she had to go to their bedroom and cry while holding the photograph. But Barrett never made her feel like she was too much or too broken. He would hold her when she needed comfort and give her space when she needed solitude, and slowly she learned that it was possible to be both grieving and happy, both remembering the past and building a future. The ranch work was hard but satisfying. Josephine learned to help with the cattle, to mend fences and tend the garden and do the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. She got better at riding and could help drive cattle when needed. Margaret taught her to can vegetables for winter, and she spent long afternoons in the main house kitchen with Barrett's mother and sisters, learning and laughing and building new bonds. In the spring of 1880, Josephine realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She wanted this child desperately, but the thought of bringing new life into the world when she had lost so much made her afraid in ways she could not articulate. Barrett found her on the porch one evening, the photograph in her lap, tears streaming down her face. "What if something happens?" she whispered. "What if I lose this baby like I lost my parents? I do not think I could survive it." Barrett sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "You might lose this baby," he said honestly, and she flinched. "There are no guarantees in life, we both know that. But you might also get to hold a healthy child in your arms in a few months. You might get to be a mother and teach our baby all the things your mother taught you." Fear of loss is real and valid, but if we let it stop us from loving, we miss out on all the good things life has to offer. Josephine leaned into him. "I am so scared." "I know. I am scared too, but we will face it together, whatever happens." She looked down at the photograph, at her own young face grinning up at her. Her parents had been brave enough to have a child knowing the world was dangerous and uncertain. They had loved her fiercely and taught her to be strong. Maybe the best way to honor them was to be that same kind of brave, to love this new life growing inside her with all the fierceness she had learned from them. The pregnancy was difficult. Josephine was sick for the first 4 months and exhausted for most of the rest. But Barrett was endlessly patient, bringing her water when she was nauseous and holding her hair back when she was sick. Margaret came to visit often, bringing food and advice and comfort. And slowly Josephine's fear gave way to cautious excitement. On a cold January day in 1881, after 14 hours of labor, Josephine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him James, after Barrett's grandfather, and when the midwife placed him in Josephine's arms, she looked down at his tiny red face and felt her heart expand to a size she had not thought possible. "Hello, James," she whispered. "I am your mother." Barrett sat beside her on the bed, his eyes wet with tears as he looked at his son. "He is perfect. He is ours," Josephine said wonderingly. She looked over at the bedside table where the photograph sat, her parents smiling out from the burned edges. "I wish they could have met him." "Tell him about them," Barrett suggested. "Tell him all the stories so that he grows up knowing where he came from." So Josephine did. As James grew from infant to toddler to curious little boy, she told him about his grandparents who had died before he was born, about his grandmother who could heal anyone and his grandfather who could build anything, about the fire that had taken them away but could not take away the love. James would sit in her lap and look at the photograph with wide eyes, tracing the burned edges with his small fingers. "They would have loved you so much," Josephine would tell him, and it was true. She could almost see her mother's delight at having a grandchild, her father's pride at teaching James to work with wood. The grief would never fully go away, but it had transformed into something softer, something that could coexist with joy and love and hope. 2 years later, in 1883, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair, and from the start she was fierce and determined. James adored his baby sister, and watching them play together filled Josephine with a contentment she had never expected to feel again. The ranch prospered. Barrett's cattle drives were successful, and they expanded their land and built a bigger house to accommodate their growing family. Emily and Rachel both married and moved to nearby towns, but they visited often with their own children, and the Harrison family gatherings were loud and chaotic and full of love. Martha retired from the saloon and came to live in a small cabin on the ranch property. She became an adopted grandmother to James and Grace, telling them stories about the old days and teaching them to play cards. Josephine would watch her with the children and feel grateful for the kindness Martha had shown a desperate girl with a burned photograph all those years ago. On quiet evenings, Josephine would sit on the porch of their home and watch the sun set over the ranch land. Barrett would join her, and they would hold hands and talk about their day. Sometimes they would bring out the photograph, and Josephine would tell him stories about her parents that she had not shared before. The edges were more worn now from gentle handling over the years, the faces even less visible than they had been, but the love they represented was as clear as ever. "Do you still have hard days?" Barrett asked her once. "Sometimes," Josephine admitted. "Certain times of year are harder than others. Their birthdays, the anniversary of the fire, but it is different now. The grief is still there, but it does not consume me the way it used to. I can be sad and grateful at the same time, can miss them while also being deeply happy with the life I have built." "They would be proud of you," Barrett said. Josephine looked at him, at this man who had saved her not by trying to fix her or erase her pain, but simply by being patient and kind and steady, who had never asked her to explain or justify or move on faster, who had helped her carry her grief until she was strong enough to carry it herself without being crushed by the weight. "I am proud of me too," she said. "I survived something I did not think I could survive, and I did not just survive, I built something beautiful. That is not nothing." In 1887, when James was 6 and Grace was 4, the family made a trip to Sacramento. It was Josephine's first time back since she had fled 9 years earlier. She was terrified, but Barrett held her hand and the children chattered excitedly in the back of the wagon, and slowly her fear eased. She took them to the place where her parents' house had stood. Someone else had built there now, a new family living in a new home. Josephine stood on the street looking at it, the photograph in her hand, and felt surprisingly little pain. That house was gone and her parents were gone, but she was still here. Their love for her had not died in the fire, it had just transformed, living on in the stories she told, and the way she raised her children and the kindness she tried to show to others. "Goodbye," she whispered to the photograph, to her parents, to the girl she used to be. "Thank you for everything." They visited Josephine's aunt, who wept to see her looking so healthy and happy. She fussed over James and Grace, and told Barrett he was a good man for taking such good care of her niece. When they left, Josephine promised to write more often and actually meant it. On the way back to Chico, as the wagon rolled through the California landscape, James asked to see the photograph. Josephine handed it to him and watched as he studied it carefully. "They look nice," he said simply. "They were the best people I ever knew," Josephine told him, "except for you and your sister and your father." "And Grandma Margaret," Grace added loyally. "And Grandma Margaret," Josephine agreed with a laugh. That night they stayed at an inn halfway between Sacramento and Chico. After the children were asleep, Josephine and Barrett sat by the window looking out at the stars. "Thank you," Josephine said quietly. "For what?" "For never asking me to explain, for accepting me with all my broken pieces, for helping me become whole again without trying to erase the parts of me that were hurt." Barrett pulled her close. "You never needed to thank me for loving you, Josephine. That has been the easiest thing I ever did." She kissed him, putting all her love and gratitude into it, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The fire that had destroyed everything she knew. The months of wandering and grief, walking into Martha's saloon with nothing but burned photograph and $3. Meeting a cowboy who never asked her to explain. Learning to carry her grief instead of being crushed by it. Finding love again, building a family, creating a life that honored both her past and her future. The photograph was still precious to her, still something she would always treasure. But it was no longer her last breath. It was just one breath among many, one piece of her story instead of the whole thing. Her parents would always be part of her, their love woven into the fabric of who she was, but they were no longer the only part. She was also Barrett's wife and James and Grace's mother, and a rancher, and a friend, and a woman who had survived and thrived. Years passed in the warm rhythm of family life. James grew tall and serious like his father, taking to ranch work with natural skill. Grace grew fierce and wild, more interested in horses than anything else, and Josephine saw echoes of herself in her daughter's determination. In 1889 they welcomed another son, Thomas, and 2 years later a daughter named Caroline. The house was loud and messy and full of laughter. Everything Josephine had never let herself hope for in those dark days after the fire. Barrett's parents grew older and eventually passed away peacefully in their sleep, first his father, and then, 2 years later, his mother. Josephine grieved for them, but it was a gentler grief than what she had known before. She understood now that loss was part of life, that love always came with the risk of pain, but that the love was worth it anyway. Martha passed away in 1894, surrounded by family in her little cabin on the ranch. Josephine held her hand at the end and whispered her thanks for the kindness shown to a desperate girl so many years ago. Martha smiled and squeezed her fingers and said she had known from the start that Josephine was strong enough to survive anything. Josephine cried for days after, but she also smiled when she thought about the sharp-tongued, kind-hearted woman who had given her a chance when she needed it most. The photograph grew more worn with the passing years. The faces were almost completely obscured now, more suggestion than image. But Josephine could still see them clearly in her mind, could still remember every detail even without the visual reminder. She kept it in a special box Barrett had made, taking it out occasionally to share with the children or just to remind herself where she had come from. In 1898, James married a kind girl from town named Sarah, and they built a house on the ranch property. The following year, Grace shocked everyone by announcing she was joining a Wild West show to perform trick riding. Josephine was terrified but also proud, and she stood with Barrett waving goodbye as their daughter rode off toward her own adventure. Thomas grew into a quiet boy who loved books more than cattle, and Josephine encouraged his education even when others thought it was impractical. Caroline grew beautiful and clever, and Josephine saw echoes of her own mother in the gentle way Caroline cared for hurt animals and sick calves. On a warm evening in May of 1899, 21 years after Josephine had first walked into Chico clutching a burned photograph, she sat on the porch with Barrett watching the sunset. They were both graying now, their faces lined with years of sun and work and laughter. Their oldest son was married with a baby on the way. Their oldest daughter was performing in front of crowds across the country. Their younger children were growing into remarkable people. The ranch was prosperous and the family was healthy. "You ever regret it?" Barrett asked suddenly. "Saying yes to me all those years ago," Josephine looked at him in surprise. "Never, not once. You saved my life, Barrett Harrison." "You saved mine too," he said. "I was just going through the motions before I met you. You taught me that strength is not about never being hurt. It is about surviving the hurt and still choosing to love." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other then." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned gold and pink and purple. Josephine thought about the girl she had been, broken and grieving and so certain she would never feel whole again. She thought about her parents and the home that had burned and the life she had lost. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and the healing and the slow, difficult process of learning to live again. The photograph was in its box inside, no longer clutched in her hand like her last breath. She did not need to hold it constantly to remember. Her parents were woven into her now, part of the fabric of who she was, inseparable from her but no longer consuming her. Their love lived on in the stories she told, in the way she raised her children, in the kindness she tried to show the world. And she had learned that honoring their memory did not mean staying stuck in grief. It meant living the kind of full, loving life they would have wanted for her. Barrett took her hand and squeezed it gently. Josephine squeezed back, feeling the calluses on his palm that matched the ones on hers. These were hands that had worked hard and loved well, that had held babies and mended fences and wiped away tears. These were the hands of a life fully lived. "I love you," she told him. "Thank you for never asking me to explain." "I love you too," Barrett said, "and you are welcome. Though you know you could explain anything to me now and I would listen." "I know," Josephine said, "but some things are better felt than explained. You understood that from the start, and it made all the difference." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they sat together on the porch they had built, in the life they had created, surrounded by the family they had raised. The photograph was tucked safely inside, no longer her last breath but a treasured piece of her history. And Josephine Garrett Harrison, who had once been a girl broken by loss, was finally, completely, joyfully whole. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. James and Sarah welcomed 3 children, and Josephine delighted in being a grandmother, teaching her grandchildren the same lessons her mother had taught her. Grace came home from the Wild West show in 1902 with a husband, a fellow performer named Daniel, and they settled on a small ranch of their own near the family property. Thomas went to university in San Francisco and became a teacher, returning to Chico to educate the next generation. Caroline married a doctor and moved to Sacramento, where she volunteered at the hospital and used her gentle touch to bring comfort to the sick. Through it all, Josephine and Barrett remained each other's constant. They worked the ranch together, raised their children and grandchildren together, and grew old together with grace and gratitude. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, their children threw them a celebration with half the town in attendance. Josephine wore her silver hair in a simple bun and her best dress, and when Barrett took her hand to dance, she felt 19 again, standing on a hilltop choosing to let love in despite her fear. 25 years, Barrett said as they swayed to the music. Best years of my life. Mine too, Josephine agreed. Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for letting me love you, he replied. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Josephine took out the photograph. The images were almost completely gone now, just shadows and suggestions on the burned paper. But she could still see her parents clearly, could still hear her mother's voice and feel her father's strong arms. They were gone but never forgotten, loved and honored but no longer the only love in her life. She showed the photograph to her oldest granddaughter, James's daughter Emily, named after Barrett's sister. These were my parents, she told the 6-year-old girl. Your great-grandparents. They died in a fire when I was not much older than your mother is now. Emily studied the photograph with serious eyes. Were you very sad? I was so sad I thought I might die from it, Josephine said honestly. I carried this photograph everywhere and held onto it like it was the only thing keeping me alive. But you did not die, Emily observed. No, I did not. I met your grandfather, and he helped me learn that you can carry sadness and still find joy. That you can remember the people you lost and still make room for new love. I am glad you found joy, Emily said simply. Otherwise I would not be here. Josephine hugged her granddaughter close, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair. I am glad too, sweetheart. I am very glad too. As the sun set on another day, Josephine stood on the porch of the home she and Barrett had built and looked out over the ranch land. The house where they had raised 4 children. The barn where James taught his sons to work with horses. The garden where Caroline had learned to love growing things. The open fields where Grace had first learned to ride, practicing the tricks that would eventually take her across the country. This was her life now, built from the ashes of her old life, constructed carefully and lovingly over years of hard work and patience. Her parents' love was the foundation, but Barrett's love was the walls and the roof, and her children's love was the light streaming through the windows. She was no longer the girl who clutched a burned photograph like her last breath. She was a woman who had survived tragedy and found happiness again, who honored her past while embracing her future, who had learned that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart. Barrett came out to stand beside her, sliding his arm around her waist. They stood together in the fading light, watching their grandchildren play in the yard below, and Josephine felt a peace so deep it made her eyes water. This was what her parents would have wanted for her. This love, this family, this full and beautiful life. The photograph would always be precious, but it was no longer her only treasure. She had built something new from the ruins of her old life, and it was good and right and whole. Happy? Barrett asked softly. More than I ever thought possible, Josephine replied, and she meant it with all her heart.